So, good morning, everybody. I hope you had a good long weekend. If you're from south of the border, then happy Independence Day, July 4th, very exciting. If you don't know me, my name is Craig Kaplan. I'm a professor here in the School of Computer Science. I'm also the chair of the CS 50th Anniversary Committee. We're trying to put together fun events throughout the year to celebrate different parts of our history and maybe look a bit into the future of computer science. So in particular, one of the events we definitely wanted to hold at some point this year was a celebration of the hardware, the history of hardware and the computing technology. I'm looking over there. Here at the University of Waterloo, the glorious moments, the excitement, the people, the sordid history hidden away in closets. And so to that end, we have three great speakers today, and in fact, a live hardware demo. So it's going to be an exciting morning, followed by lunch. So without further ado, I will introduce the first of the three speakers. I will perform the ceremonial reading of the bio, because I think the speakers provided excellent bios. So Eric Manning, who is joining us from Victoria, BC. Eric was the first graduating class in honors math and physics at UW in 1961. I believe that's not a typo. Was the graduating class.
That's correctly worded.
Yes. Following much head scratching by US grad schools who didn't know what to make of his class standing.
One out of one.
Yeah, exactly, one of one.
First
Serial
and
number
last.
00001. He got a PhD in electrical engineering for his work on fault-tolerant computing. He was then assistant professor and Ford Fellow at MIT, where he was responsible for hardware fault tolerance in the Multix project, and member of technical staff at Bell Telephone Laboratories Incorporated. Following his return to UW, he was an associate and then full professor of computer science and electrical engineering and founding director of the Computer Communications Network Group and the Institute of Computer Research, ICR. He became a founding dean of the Faculty of Engineering at UVic in 1986. He likes to start things. And if you want to know more, Eric refers us to the book published by Peter Ponzo for our 25th anniversary. I note in particular, there is a great page with two old photos of Eric, first as an undergraduate and then as director of ICR. So I'll hand the floor over to Eric.
Well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Well, it's really nice to be back here at my old home stamping ground after all these years. I'm really pleased to be here and to be able to talk to you people. And I'd like to say that I'm going to do my best to give a full, honest, complete, and factual account of these days, but like anything of this nature, it's a question of perception. And in the matter of perception and how much it can tilt things, I offer the following true story. At the beginning of the Vietnam War, President Kennedy sent two very knowledgeable, expert, and people of high integrity to Vietnam to find out what the hell was going on. One was General Maxwell Taylor, who was very high in the U.S. General Staff, and the other was a very senior person in the United States State Department. It might have been Dean Rusk, I'm not sure. So they both sent him their reports, and he read them, and then he had them in. And as they sat down, the first thing he said to them was, "You two did visit the same country, right?" So that's just my little story about perception and what it can do to reality. So forgive me in advance, and if Dawn turns purple, you'll know why. Well, the first thing I'd like to do is take you back to the late Jurassic, namely the 1960s, and remind you briefly of the state of technology then. So computing was almost universally batch processing. That means the CPU was mono-programmed, one program at a time until it either crashed, which it usually did, or ran to completion. And then you could run another program. And so if you submitted a batch job, as it was called, on a deck of cards, they were pasteboard things that you knocked holes in, and that's how information was, I'm not making this up, that's how information was actually recorded. You might very well wait overnight or even days to get your answer back and discovered that you'd left a semicolon out in the commands to the operating system, and so you could start all over again. There was one refreshing and revolutionary exception to all this, which came to be known as interactive batch, and of course that was the Wat4 compiler. And when I arrived at MIT, the first question the director of Project Mac, multi-access computing, Robert Fano, the information theorist, had for me was, "So what's the gimmick?" And I said, "Huh?" And he said, what's the gimmick? What's this, how does this Wat4 thing work? And I said, oh, very simple. It's entirely core resident. And he said, oh, yes, right? Yeah. What it really was a major advancement in software engineering, but we were too ignorant to know that it was software engineering. There was no such term. And personally, I think Paul Dirksen certainly should have gotten a PhD in software engineering. But of course, we just didn't know. We were ignorant. So a little bit of history. So there's a wonderful exception to that otherwise bleak picture of batch. Now, time sharing, meaning time division multiplexing of the CPU, if you're an engineer, or if you're not, sharing the CPU, giving everybody a little bit of it in time, was just beginning to appear. Fernando Corbato at MIT had taken an IBM 7090, which was these days a large-scale scientific computer, and he'd written a very simple thing called the compatible time-sharing system. And it would support, I guess, maybe 20 terminals. And it was honest-to-goodness time-sharing in that you could not only manipulate files, but you could start programs, run them, interact with them, and so forth. That would be about 1964. Now I'd like to deliver a little harangue about design generality. In mathematics, generality is generally considered to be a good thing, and I suppose in theoretical computer science also. In engineering, generality, overgenerality can be a very awful thing. And as Exhibit A, I offer this pig. This thing attempts to fill the roles of sedan and pickup truck. You will notice that as a pickup truck, it's pretty pathetic. It has a little tiny bed, it has a little tiny engine. If you put anything heavy in it, it would break down. And as a sedan, it's even worse. It has exactly one seat, namely the front seat, the bench seat, and it's underpowered, blah, blah, blah. So there's Exhibit 1. Now, on the next slide, this is a relatively minor design blunder. Here we have the United States military's F-111. Now, otherwise known as McNamaras Folly. Now, Robert S. McNamara was not an engineer, rather he belonged to the tribe who are the natural enemies of engineers, that would be the accountants. And as an accountant, when he became Secretary of Defense, he thought like an accountant, understandably, and he found that there was practically an infinite number of aircraft that the US forces owned. And every one of these things had to be designed, manufactured, repaired, spare parts inventory stocked, people trained, et cetera, et cetera. So each one of them had a great big long logistical tail behind it, very, very expensive. So there were trainers, there were fighters, which were light and fast and didn't carry bombs. And then there were bigger planes that did carry bombs, bombers, and then there were transport planes. And furthermore, there were frequently versions for the Air Force and the Navy and the Marines, and whenever they weren't actually stopped by main force, the Army would have to have one too. And he calculated the cost, and of course it was absolutely appalling, so you can see what's coming. He said, we're going to have one airplane, and it's going to do it all for you, like McDonald's. So this is what happened. It was a complete disaster. The Navy version, which had to, of course, take off and land on carrier decks, never did even get built. The rest of them got built, but it just went nowhere because it was far too heavy and clumsy to be a decent fighter, and it didn't have enough bomb load to be a good bomber, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So several $1 billion later, there we have Exhibit B about excessive generalization. Any comments? Questions? He knows where this is going. Next. So, we now turn to the world of computing. And I'm going to submit to you that IBM repeated this blunder with the System 360, 1963 following. This turned out to be a $5 billion bet. They originally thought it would be $500 million. And I would remind you that you should probably multiply all these numbers at least by 20 to get today's dollars. So you're probably talking about $100 billion. This is small-scale integrated, mainly a few transistors on a chip, or discrete logic, meaning one transistor on a chip. Forbes kindly brought me an exhibit. It looks like this. These are transistors, individual transistors. These are diodes. All of this would today be a spot, maybe 1 micron by 1/1,000,000 of a meter by 1/1,000,000 of a meter on the surface of an integrated circuit. But that's how it was back then. That's the logic that was available. We had, of course, a number of them at Waterloo. For the Model 75, I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, one day we got our second megabyte of memory. It was delivered on a truck. And as I recall, we had champagne, yes, to install it. Just so to give you a picture, and as you know these days, 1 megabyte is a little tiny corner of a thing you buy at London Drugs for 10 bucks. So times have changed. And there were models all the way from Model 30, I think I'm correct. It was basically hardly a computer up to Model 91, which was a very powerful scientific machine pipelined within an inch of its life. Why'd they do it? Same story. They felt too many product lines. They had one line of computers just for business data processing. Typically, they were character addressed. Typically, they had decimal arithmetic and so forth, lots of I/O to handle tapes and things. And then they had the scientific line for which the opposite was true. And same thing, too many programming languages too, you know, Fortran, COBOL, on and on and on. And they would try to kill them from time to time. One wag was once asked, what is going to be the programming language for engineering of the 21st century? And he said, I have no idea, but I can tell you what it'll be called, Fortran. Yes, so try to kill a programming language, you know, is a bootless enterprise. So, it's predictable what they came up with. The instruction set of the 360 was a union, in the set theoretic sense, of instruction sets, very complex. The language they cooked up, which they hopefully was going to do away with all these other inconvenient languages, notwithstanding that Rolls-Royce has something like $5 billion worth of design software for their turbofans, all written in Fortran, was called PL1, Programming Language 1. And it was a union of languages. It had a Fortran-like part, and it had a COBOL-like part, and it had a string processing-like part, and on into the night. For my sins, I was at one point given the task by Professor Wesley Graham of supervising Gus Graham and Bob Zarnke in the project to try to create a Watt4-like, I don't know if you knew this, PL1 compiler. And we just gave up, because every time we beat one piece of it, it turned out there were an infinite number of other pieces that we didn't even know about. So after a while, I killed the project, and that's what happened to PL1 Waterloo. Because of all this complexity, and I remember this for a fact, to compile the trivial program stop-end in PL1 on the PL1 F-level compiler on our 36075, which was like the second biggest machine in the line at the time, required 30 seconds. That's nothing else going on in the computer, just the PL1F compiler going through all these phases, phase after phase after phase. Another little goodie, in order to establish addressability of real memory, you had to execute code. So you couldn't even assume that you were able to address, not virtually, but really, a particular memory cell until you'd established addressability of it. Nevertheless, hubris, the Greeks, pride leading to downfalls, caused Garrett Blau, who was one of the System 360 architects, to write a paper with his colleagues called The End of Architecture, in which he modestly suggested that it was the subject of computer architecture was now a closed book. They had now done it forever. This is a little bit like Francis Fukuyama of the US State Department, who wrote a paper called The End of History not long ago that suggested that all was well. The United States was running the world nicely, and there would be no history, no need to write any more history books. I'm not making this stuff up, I really am not. Also, I point out that the corporate name is International Business Machine, capital business, so my own opinion is it's great for applications. I mean, you were crazy in those days if you wrote an application for anything else, because IBM's role at that time and for many years thereafter was much like Microsoft's role today, domination of the market. I think they had something like 90% market share, and they were actually caught trying to, under the table, help their competitors, who were called the Seven Dwarfs. That would be Univac, RCA, et cetera, because if one of them went out of business, it would attract the attention of the antitrust people. So they were kind of performing a reverse antitrust crime, so to speak. However, for computer science, things like architecture, operating systems, graphics, it was fatal because, you know, you didn't mess around with the thing. They didn't, it was not what we call today open source, to put it mildly. In fact, by a way of making it as difficult as possible for you to leave the IBM fold, the embrace of IBM, there was a code called EBCDIC, which was exactly identical to ASCII, isomorphic, except it was different. And the entire point of it was to be different, so that an ASCII code could not be interpreted, so that if you wanted to leave the IBM world, why, you had that to face with. Also, at one time, there was a data communications company, Gandalf, in Ottawa, that made a data communications processor that would essentially handle a lot of low-speed telephone lines. This was when time sharing had started to come along. And they were attaching them to IBM mainframes, and they were half the price of the IBM product. So IBM actually resorted to redefining the interface dynamically. So on the fly, they would rewrite a memory that would say what the definition of the various bits of interface was, and this information would only be sent to the other side of the interface, the processor, if it was the IBM one. Otherwise, it would just stop dead. So, true stories. This is the part I've promised about Tales from the Crypt. Pardon?
The early public key encryption.
Sorry?
That protocol is the early public key encryption.
Yes, exactly. It's very easy public key encryption, yes. So that's something you might look up if you're interested in security. I'll have a couple other hints too a little later on. So now I'd like to briefly tell you about a bit of my personal history. That's the relevant bit. So when I was a very, very junior faculty member at MIT way back when, I encountered CTSS, which was very nice, and I was right in the middle of the Multix project. The Multix project's a little hard to describe. It basically attempted to be what was called in those days a computer utility. And the thought there was that, could we show the picture of, this is the Multix GE 6000 line installation at IRIA, the Institut de Recherche en Informatique et Automatique, the French government's National Computer Science and Control Theory Laboratory, where I worked for many summers. This is a large Multix installation. Perhaps you can see why it was not unnatural to think of that as a bit like the Ontario Hydro, Bruce Nuclear, or something like that, or a major water plant. So the idea was, because this thing was so huge and massive, and nobody but a huge institution could possibly even think of affording one, therefore it should be thought of as like a utility. It would dispense computing and information just the way that Ontario Hydro allegedly dispenses, you know, power and so forth. In fact, a book was written by a Canadian. It was called The Challenge of the Computer Utility by Doug Parkhill, who then went to the new Department of Communications in Ottawa as an assistant deputy minister and drove the fledgling computer industry crazy by coming out with horrifying policies. So, given the background of all this and the success of CTSS, Corbateau started to think megalomaniac thoughts too. So he went to IBM and he said, give me $1 billion and I'll make you king of the world. I will create the ultimate operating system, Multix, which stood for multiplexed, i.e. multiplex CPU, multiplex disk, multiplexed everything, shared in time, information and computing system. IBM said, we're up to our backside in alligators trying to get System 360 out the door, so get stuffed. So Corby then went to General Electric Computer Department in Black Canyon Highway, Phoenix, Arizona, and said, give me $1 billion and I will make you king of the world. And they did. So the result was the GE 635, which was a fairly conventional GE batch system, got some heavy modification at MIT, and the hardware mods were led by Ted Glaser, who last time I looked was chair of computer science at Case Western down there in Cleveland. Ted was 100% sightless, totally sightless. Ted, nevertheless, was an absolutely crack hardware designer. And how the hell he did it, I have no idea, because I wouldn't dream of trying to design anything hardware-ish without being able to draw pictures, you know, or have a CAD package draw pictures so I could visualize the interconnections and where everything was. But he did it all in his head, and I still don't know how he did it. So they added virtual memory hardware, which was both paging, and by the way, there were 2 page sizes, 64 words and 1 kiloword, because you know, some pages had a little bit of information, some had a lot. I think it finally got dropped because the overhead of doing that just wasn't worth the trouble. And on top of that, it also had segmentation, where of course a segment is a big thing made of an essentially indefinite number of pages, almost to an almost infinite length, but not quite. Another of the interesting features was they took protection very seriously. Now here's where I'd like the people interested in security to listen carefully. They implemented a solution for protection to provide access, kind of like capabilities, in hardware, and it was called protection rings. And so essentially, and I think this is true, I can't be positive, but the claim was the only way you could beat this thing, hack it, would be with a soldering iron and a pair of side cutters, because it was done in hardware, not in software. The Pentagon took this sufficiently serious that they hired a large number of people to stand around a large number of Multix systems, Marines with automatic weapons. And the apocryphal story was if you were typing at a console and something happened that shouldn't have happened, they'd shoot you. This is probably just an urban myth, who knows? But the factual part is the Pentagon had, and I think still has, a very large number of Multix machines. So, it had its problems. Morven Gentleman, who was a faculty member here, was the founding director of MFCF, was at the time also at Bell Labs, and in his lab they had a Multix machine, and one of the many defects that Morven noticed was that Multix had no notion whatsoever of time. So it had a storage hierarchy, so if you wanted to touch a particular bit of information, if you were really lucky, if it had been used very recently, it would be in primary memory, or core as we called it then. If it wasn't there, it might be on the drum, which was a thing that went around shaped like a garbage can. If it wasn't there, it might be on disk. If it wasn't there, it might be on tape. And if the tape wasn't mounted on a tape drive, there was a warehouse in Secaucus, New Jersey, way on the far side of New Jersey, where they kept the tapes. So when you asked for this bit of information, it might be anything from 10 microseconds to 10 days before this bit of information returned. And there was absolutely no way for the user to know. So that's just one of many Morven stories. So he was less than overwhelmed with Multix. For my part, I was present when they made many innovations. For example, it was process structured, big funny processes, but I think they were the first to do that. And to my knowledge, it's the first operating system that was ever written in a higher level language. The only candidate available was Shutter PL1. So I was present on the day when they finished writing the code for the file system, and the code alone, no files, just code, completely overflowed main memory. So Multix staggered along, and eventually several dozen of them were built. Now, there were two other guys at Bell Labs named Kernahan and Ritchie who were appalled by this sort of megalomaniac, tomorrow the world, attitude, this sort of ideological underpinning. And so as a rebuke, a sort of slap on the wrist to Multix, they created the name Unix, which is the opposite of Multix, many or one, you see. And they wrote a very simple little operating system that was absolutely primitive and then made no assumptions and used very few resources. And that, my friends, is how Unix came to be. It was sort of a cry of protest against the world of Multix. For myself, I was in charge of fault tolerance for the GE 645, and I could tell them what it died of, but I couldn't bring it back to life because it was way too late in the design cycle. So I made a few pleasant trips down to Black Canyon Highway where the GE computer department was, and I got them to put in a few leads so they could use a program to test the state of various parts of the internal machine state. That was about the size of it. Meanwhile, I'm at the Indian Hill lab of Bell Labs trying to write simulators that will simulate both the good version of a large piece of hardware like a CPU and all the failed versions. So if it had 10,000 possible failures, I was doing a parallel simulation of 10,000 versions of the machine, the good one and all the failed versions, from which you could develop ways the machine could diagnose its own faults. I was attempting to do this on an IBM 360-67, which was going to run TSS 360, and they said, you're going to love it, but unfortunately, it didn't happen. To back to my knowledge, it never did happen. Perhaps someone could correct me. Apparently not. But here's a very interesting story. In the process of developing TSS 360, all the developers had only 1 or 2 Model 67s to share, and they were using it in batch mode. So some bright spark got the idea, why don't we write a little bit of code that will just chop up the CPU and give you half a second, and then me half a second, and then him half a second, and we can do the same with the disks. And we'll make what makes kind of like a ghostly copy of the machine, only it's slower. And that way you can all do things at once. This was strictly in-house, strictly internal. A salesman could get shot, fired for disclosing its existence, but the users found out about it anyways, and of course they demanded it because it actually worked. And it came to be known as VM370, and that's how it all came to pass. True story. Well, so that's kind of the mix that leads up to this computer selection process. So Morven was very much involved in this, obviously. Morven had headed up to here with Multix. I was very much involved in it, and I'd headed up to here with the IBM 360 Model 67 in the TSSS that was all promises and no delivery. And there's another thing I should mention, which was that the attitude, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the culture at Waterloo at the time, when we started, and when I came here in '59, we were nothing. We were literally nothing. U of T didn't even bother making fun of us. I mean, it was like kicking, you know, it was like kicking a wounded dog. It was just sort of bullying. And so we had nothing to lose. And so we radically innovated, because what the hell? What's the downside? Zero. We're already seen as zero, so it's all upside. So hence co-op, and hence the ring road, and hence all sorts of unheard of things, like an engineering school is kind of the centerpiece rather than the arts and sciences is the centerpiece, you know? And by God, it worked. So there was kind of very much a spirit of let's be different. We're not going to get anywhere by just being like everybody else. You know, our sort of route to the top was doing that, and boy, was it effective. Here's a personal story. When I got to Victoria, I started the mechanical engineering department, and I hired a really good mechanical engineering professor from Toronto, Bez Tabarrok, and we got talking about Waterloo, and he said, U of T mechanical engineering, we were just absolutely stunned. One day we were lords of the universe. There was nobody else in Canada that could even be mentioned in the same breath as us without snickering. And my God, all of a sudden, here's these guys down there in this farmer's field, and they're getting more attention in the world press than we are. That's quote, direct quote from Bez. So, you know, it worked. It really bloody well worked. So that's kind of the mindset. Now, I'd like to give you a little history. So on the next picture we have the first computer that was actually used for computing at Waterloo. Let's see, somewhere here should be the UNIVAC. Oh, there it is. Can you just bring this up? Got a little more up? It's the next one. Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay. So this is a vacuum tube computer, that's circa 1956. Do you notice where it says UNIVAC system, just to the right of that, that's an open door. And the way you repair faults of this computer is you open that door and you walk into the computer. There's a corridor down there on the inside, and you're surrounded by hot glowing vacuum tubes. And you pull your oscilloscope and your VTVM and whatnot behind you, and also a little rubber, like the end of a pencil, you tap the tubes with, so if they cause a looping program to go off, you know you found a bad tube. This one was at London Life Insurance Company in London, Ontario, and they had to remove the roof from the building in order to install it. There are also rumors they had to buy a substantial part of Niagara Falls output in order to provide the necessary power, to say nothing of the air conditioning. So Professor Rocco Leonard Martino was an aeronautical engineer, aerodynamics analysis and all that stuff from the U of T Institute of Aerospace Studies. He was working at UNIVAC, and he was part-time at Waterloo. So we used to punch up little card decks, and Rocky would take them in a Chevy and run them overnight and then bring them back with all the mistakes in them. So that, I think, was actually the very first computer used by math at Waterloo. So moving right along, on the next picture, we have, that's called a Bendix G15. Sorry for the terrible quality of the picture. It's vacuum tube. It was run by an interpreter. We had it for about 3 months, and then it went away. So moving right along, IBM struck, and there is the IBM 1620, which was curious because it was actually originally the IBM 1401, which was a business data processing thing, so it had addressing by digits. And then it was kind of scientified, and that was it. So that was it for at least a couple of years, and as I recall, it ran by paper tape. And then, of course, came the IBM 36075 in the Red Room and so forth. Now, as for math, the first thing that happened is that because Wes had come from IBM, and because IBM was the Microsoft of the day, and because if you were interested in applications, which is certainly what Wes was interested in, you'd be nuts to write them for anything other than IBM, because there was this enormous economy of scale, kind of like the networking economy of scale we've discovered recently, namely, the more people that use something, the more valuable it is to have it. So they kind of reinforce each other. Naturally, he got us an IBM 360 Model 50 running a programming language, APL, which I won't say much other than it had a very strange character set. And you could write a statement that could apply to a scalar, a vector, a matrix, or a tensor of, I think, any rank.
We'll get to see it there.
Oh, will we? Okay, that'd be good. Yeah, good to hear. So basically, we needed time sharing. Basically, those of us who'd done other places understood there was more to the world, at least for computing research, than IBM. And so we formed a committee, and we were both allergic to Multix because of Morven's experience, and I was very allergic to the IBM 367 because of my horrible experiences. So according to Peter Ponzo, there was a committee that consisted of Morven, Pat Fisher, who was the irascible chairman of computer science at the time, and Wes. And of course, to imagine those three, let's say, agreeing on anything in this line is incomprehensible. And so Peter Ponzo says, poof, a decision emerged. Well, it wasn't quite like that. Actually, there was a committee, and I chaired it. And I distinctly remember making the committee's unanimous announcing the unanimous decision, which was Honeywell. Now, how did that happen? Well, next picture. Yeah. Kind of the little brother to IBM, and the favorite, kind of the trendy computer, the fashionable one for computer science departments, was Digital Equipment Corporation's PDP-10. And it had the great advantage that it was great for graphics, and there was a lot of interesting work in operating systems and architecture being done based on it, so you'd be part of a community. And then there was Honeywell, and so we wrote an RFP, request for proposals, and explicitly in the RFP it said must not have the IBM 360 architecture, which today would probably be illegal, but anyways we got away with it. But by God, give IBM credit, they bid. And what did they bid? They bid a 360-67 plus a promise to write emulators for any architecture we desired. So you got to give them credit. Like, those guys just did not let go. You know, they just kept hammering away, which has a lot to do with their success, of course. So that brought us down to DEC versus Honeywell. And the Canadian branch manager of DEC, Denny Doyle in Ottawa, offered a fairly decent discount, like 50%, something like that. But he was pretty snug, you know. He was fat and happy. I won't say dumb, because he thought for sure we were just going to fall into line. And because everybody else had a PDP-10, so of course we want a PDP-10. Well, of course, I mentioned this prickly Waterloo spirit of let's not follow everybody else. Honeywell got really hungry because they didn't really have much street cred at all in the computer science, computer engineering community. So they practically gave us the machine, and it was a large data processing system with a lot more throughput, a lot more of everything than the PDP-10. Plus, Morven really liked it because it gave him a chance to kind of make Honeywell a competitor in the academic world. So Morven not only ran the thing, but he also was able to form a large group of people who we called the hacks. Those hacker did not mean a bad person. Hacker meant a person who was a programmer, etc. For example, Rick Beach, David Cheriton, the Coherent Operating System, Randall Howard and Julie McMullen, they were all part of this. Michael Offeld, Kieran O'Donnell. They had a lot of good fun, and they did a lot of very, very interesting software development and research. One thing I could mention is one of Morven's many good ideas was that every Friday we offered a beer in what was called the faculty club back then for free to the student who'd made the most spectacular bust of the Honeywell security and would then come and tell us about it. And in this way, we found an awful lot of security bugs in a big hurry, you know, set a thief to catch a thief. But that was the thing, they had to tell us about it, and they were not to sort of profit or steal any information, just tell us they'd found it possible how to fix it. And I remember being interviewed on a CBC program, and the whole thing was, my God, aren't you just encouraging them all to turn into little criminals? So I tried to deal with that as best I could. I still think it was the right thing to do. Probably couldn't do it today. So there we were, and I don't think Pat and Morven was, I don't think Pat or Wes were on my committee, because I can't remember who was on it, and I am absolutely certain, despite my failing memory, if it's happened more than 5 minutes ago and less than 40 years ago, I don't have a clue. I'm pretty sure that I would remember if those gentlemen, strong personalities that they were on the committee. But anyways, that's the fact. There was a committee, we reached a unanimous decision, and that's it. And that's the end of my story. And I'd be very happy for the opposition. Thank you.
So we definitely have time to take a few questions, comments, maybe barbs, brickbats, as they may be. I will repeat any questions for recording purposes.
Come on, Don.
Put them up, put them up.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, you were,
I failed.
Yeah, yeah.
I did badly by doing good, unlike the old dope peddler who did well by doing good. Oh.
That's funny. Well, do you have, okay, Trevor.
Could you speak to the selection of operating system that you used on the Honeywell? Because as I recall,
sure.
Honeywell was capable of running Multix, but I understand now why that wasn't going to happen.
Correct.
What considerations
Yes.
went into
So let me just repeat the question.
Oh,
So
sorry.
Trevor's asking, can you comment on the selection of operating systems
Sure.
for the Honeywell?
See, because of the MIT pitch, there were now, the Honeywell limb branched into two. There were the ones that had the Multix hardware, namely the segmentation hardware, and also, by the way, a huge drum called the fire hose drum, which the joke was the building would point north forever once the drum was started up. So those were the Multix machines. And then there was the old normal product line. So we got the normal product line because the last thing in the world we wanted was effing Multix because of the bitter experiences of Morven and others. So we got a Honeywell 6050 running GCOS, the General Electric Comprehensive Operating System, which was doing time slicing and so forth. And so he had the beginnings of a really good system. And of course, he just worked his tail off, as did all these very bright people. And they made it really, really quite something. And then it was succeeded by a bunch of later Honeywell developments. Yeah.
So just reminiscing about an evil instruction, the equivalent of a fork bomb, I guess, from my era, right? Take down the machine. Yeah. I'm just repeating the comment.
Yeah.
All right.
I think that's it. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious. I'll add something because you mentioned the seemingly absurd idea of compute as a utility, as it was in INRI in France. But on the other hand, the pendulum kind of swings in that direction periodically, and I'd say we're there now. Yeah. So how does it feel? I mean, can you comment on compute essentially being offered as a service from somewhere off in the...
Deja vu all over again. Yogi Berra.
Yeah.
I think it makes a little more sense now because, of course, we now have the internet. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention about INRIA. In the 1970s, INRIA created or invented all the major features of what became the internet in 1980. TCP, which was called the Station de Transport, or transport station, datagram service, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they built a network, which I had a bit role. My student, Merrick Ireland, and I did all the performance modeling, queuing theory, and evaluation of it. They built a network which, in all intents and purposes, was the internet, connected 5 French government sites in metropolitan France. It was running in 1975. It then appeared as the internet in 1980, and all of the papers written by the Americans who did it, nowhere did they mention the fact that they'd stolen it lock, stock, and barrel from France. This injustice was recently remedied by Her Majesty Elizabeth II, who created the Queen Elizabeth Medal for Science and Engineering and awarded the very first one to none other than Monsieur Louis Pouzin, the director of Project Cyclade. Good for the Queen. Yeah. Yeah. So just another little historical byword.
So while you're reminiscing more broadly about networks, would you care to say some things about the formation of the networks group and ICR?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, let's see. I moved back here in '68, and I was doing fault-tolerant computing, and I didn't see a huge future for it in Waterloo of those days, so I started shopping around looking for a new horse to ride. And Howard Petch, who was the vice president at the time, got me a job at the Science Council of Canada, which was a science policy shop in Ottawa that reported to the Prime Minister, who was Pierre Trudeau in those days. And their mission was to give him helpful advice on science policy. And they twigged to the idea that there was something called computer networks, and people south of the border were talking about this ARPANET thing. And so they got me on it, and I went over to France, which was where I covered the CICLAD guys, and I talked to the French PTT, and I talked to the National Physical Lab in Great Britain, who'd just done what was really one of the world's first local area networks, except we didn't know enough to call it that then. And so I came back and I said, wow, this network stuff really looks like it might be going somewhere. There were people in electrical engineering who agreed with me. I was in computer science. And so we did an unheard of thing. We created a group that was half electrical engineering and half computer science. And then we got a nice grant. It was $800K in that money, so it was probably about 10 million in today's money. So that got us off to the races. But the university had promised space, and of course, the Dean of Math and the Dean of Engineering, of course, used us as a political football to try to score points on each other, as deans will do. And so they had no space, no space whatsoever. So I had to raise them. So I raised them and said, well, in that case, I'm just going to have to send the damn grant back. Oh, well, engineering then managed to find space, so we worked very happily for a long, long time in what is now Engineering 3?
4.
Engineering 4, yeah, right by the little driveway there. And it was also very nice for the computer science people because the atmosphere in computer science was less than salubrious. Mani Chandy, a very distinguished theoretician from Caltech, came to visit, and after he'd been here a week, I said, Manny, what do you think of the department? He said, tense. And he was absolutely right. You know, this was an outside voice. And I thought, yeah, by God, he's right. So it made it much more livable for us because we were able to spend most of our time over there in engineering country. So that's how that got started. And then we did a lot of work for Bell because Bell was having to create a data network, which they had to do in part because the report I drafted said that a Trans-Canada computer network was so important that if Bell didn't do it, the government should damn well do it for them. And there's no way Trudeau would have done that if he just didn't relate to that at all, but they didn't know that. So as a result, we probably got the world's first public tariff packet switch service about 5 years earlier than we would have otherwise, because they were seriously worried that the government would do it to them. And we gave them some short courses and explained them what is a packet and what is HDLC and so forth and so on, and it seemed to help. Yeah. Question? Oh, no, sorry, I misinterpreted. Yeah.
All right, well.
So that's how the Computer Networks Group got started.
And maybe if you have a minute to say about ICR
yeah,
as well.
ICR was all Ian Blake's fault. We were all just humming along, and we noticed increasingly that when a company or another institution wanted some research done, they neither knew nor cared anything about the bizarre and Byzantine internal structure of the University of Waterloo. They just wanted to talk to people who would make all that transparent, make it go away. And so they would try to talk to computer science, and of course the computer science people, either out of ignorance or malice, would say nothing about what electrical was doing, and vice versa. You know, siloing was already starting to show up. And so the idea was to create sort of one big umbrella that everybody could have a home in, that would have as its major role to represent the whole thing in a way that if a company came with a problem, the ICR person would be technically expert and able to say, part of that is coding theory, and part of that is software engineering, and part of that's a little bit of operating systems, and if I can just talk Ms. Smith and Ms. Jones and Mr. Davis into working on this from their 3 different departments, why we can get many millions of dollars. And so we created it, and that's what it came to be. And that's still what it is. Hey, yeah.
Okay, well, that's a great point to move on to our next speaker. So let's thank Eric again for a great day.
Thank you.